We are starting to record. Okay, I am assuming that we are recording now. So let's go to okay, yeah, that's my grandmother's old pendulum clock on the wall, by the way. All right, so this is I tell people that I teach evolution in the state of Arkansas. And, sometimes that doesn't really need a punchline. But to try to introduce the subject, I always like to start with a bit of the history of biology, which has always been an interest of mine. A little bit about why. I never used to seem to have to do this, but it's kind of hard to get away from, current events. And all this summer, we saw a considerable amount of controversy, a lot of it having to do with history, with about, whose history we should be commemorating and whose monuments need to be put up and things like that. And I think it revealed that a lot of people think history is about finding heroes and, glorifying them. Figuring out who the heroes are that you can cheer for and who the villains are that you can boo, and who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, and that we're history is supposed to kind of endorse that. I'm not teaching the history of biology in this way. I'm going to talk about a number of dead white dudes. When we get into more recent history, I can bring up some people that are not dead white or dudes, but the first couple of weeks, we're going to talk a lot about, dead white people who may or may not have been decent people. Charles Darwin being one of them, who was, quite a privileged person, but also pretty much a nice guy. Certainly one who was very progressive on certain issues for the time. But my reason for teaching biology doesn't really have anything to do with trying to find people to cheer or people to boo. You don't have to think Darwin was great if you don't want to. What I'm trying to do is convey a sense of how, how the game is played and how the sausage gets made, as they say these days, where scientific ideas come from, what sort of background gives rise to them. Scientists don't work in a vacuum. Scientists come up with ideas for reasons, and they interact with other scientists, and they interact with the greater society that they live in. And I kind of feel like it's important to try and give you some kind of sense of that, to present evolution not just as some grand idea that, came down from Mount Sinai or something like that, but something that, oh, hello, cat. Yeah, this is Fern. Some of you might remember her. Hello, cat. Good kitty. Not to present science as something that's kind of handed down from on high, but something that people argue about and sweat and strain about, and it's a process, and it's a human process, and like anything human, there's always false starts and dead ends and emotional involvement and considerable arm waving and things like that. So that's why I like to start by talking about Dr. Robert Darwin. He was a physician in the west of England, near the border with Wales, in the town of Shrewsbury. And although he wasn't a nobleman, he became quite wealthy, mostly from his medical practice. He was, in the early 1800s, this was a very low bar to clear, but he was a good doctor. um, had a very good bedside manner, a good way with dealing with patients. I mean, this is before surgery has developed anesthesia, so medicine was pretty brutal, but he was good at it. He did well. He married a wife who was quite wealthy, and this is the time that the Industrial Revolution is starting to hit in Britain. And he invested in things like canal building and railroads and things like that, and became quite comfortably well off. Certainly never missed a meal. And his 6 children grew up in quite comfortable surroundings, including his second son and 5th child, Charles Robert Darwin, who was born in 1809. That's the earliest portrait of him. This is what he looked like in 1816. The year before his mother died, sadly. His older sisters ended up raising him kind of a lot because his mother had grown ill and she died when he was, what, 8, I guess, when he was 8. Not a whole lot to report about his childhood. He hated school because it was boring. He liked running around in the fields. He and his older brother actually had a chemistry set, and they did a lot of experiments and produced so many really bad smelling compounds that one of his nicknames as a child was Gas. Because evidently his chemistry didn't smell great. And we'll fast forward through that until 1824, when Darwin enrolled in the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. Edinburgh was recognized as a great center of medical education at the time, and his dad kind of sent him off there figuring that he'd become a doctor and maybe inherit his dad's medical practice. Unfortunately, the level of education was actually really bad. One of his professors, you think professors using the same lecture notes over and over again without updating them is bad practice. His anatomy professor used to use his grandfather's lecture notes. He writes somewhere about, in a letter home, he wrote about taking his class in pharmacology. He described it as a cold breakfastless hour discoursing on the properties of rhubarb. So not real fun. And he also found he couldn't stand the sight of blood. And again, bear in mind that this is just a few years before anesthesia has been invented. And he had to watch a couple of operations done at the time when the surgeon's assistants were there to hold the screaming, struggling patient down. One of them was on a child, and he pretty much decided after the first year that he stuck it out for 2 years, but after the first year, he pretty much knew that, no way, this is not for him. Oh, that's his anatomy professor. People, medical students these days get really proud of their lab coats and their stethoscopes. Back at this time, they used to be really proud of wearing these black frock coats, and it was kind of a matter of honor that they never washed them. And Monroe apparently never changed his clothes in his life, and being an anatomy professor, he did quite a lot of dissections. So he was completely caked with who knows what kinds of bodily fluids. As Darwin said, he is so dirty in person and in actions. His grandfather had been a famous anatomy professor. The connection between, I think, the 3rd and the 4th ventricles of the brain is still called the foramen of Monroe. So his grandfather had been famous. Darwin's professor had only got the job because of his famous grandfather, and for a number of reasons, Darwin hated him. So as I've said, he pretty much knew he was done after the first year, but he did stick it out for 2 years, to try to give it an honest try. But his second year, he cut class a lot because he'd found better teachers. And he made the acquaintance of a physician by the name of Robert Grant. This is he. And Grant had given up medicine after he'd earned enough money to do it and devoted himself to invertebrate zoology, a career choice I heartily approve of, by the way. Darwin and Grant used to go down to the fishing docks. Edinburgh's on the sea, it's a port town, and asked the fishermen if they'd hauled up anything strange in their nets. Darwin actually did a couple of, I guess we'd call them undergraduate research projects, and published them on some of the local marine invertebrates around Edinburgh. And one day Grant started talking and just sort of held forth in this long monologue and left Darwin kind of slack-jawed, because Darwin had had a fairly sheltered life, but Grant had some pretty radical ideas about biology. And they'd been inspired by a French dude by the name of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Here he is. He was, I guess, still alive at this time, although living in pretty severe poverty. He'd been trained as a botanist, and when the French Revolution hit, the King of France had a royal collection of cool stuff. This was kind of a fad for kings at the time to collect art, or what they called curiosities, which would include, ancient artifacts and stuffed animals and skeletons and things like that. And when the King of France had gotten his head chopped off, they took his collection of cool stuff and called it the National Museum of Natural History, the Musée National d'Histoire Naturelle. Still there, still very much worth a visit if you ever get to go to Paris. And they hired some people to be professors, and they hired Lamarck to be the professor of insects and worms. Since he was trained as a botanist, this was not really what he was trained to do, but he went ahead and, went for it. Insects and worms, by the way, is what we now call invertebrates. And in fact, it was Lamarck that coined the word invertebrates. And he had the kind of mind that doesn't fit neatly into pigeonholes. He had done some work in trying to come up with an alternate theory of chemistry, which ended up being completely wrong in every regard, but at least he was trying to compete with people like Lavoisier that you might have heard of. And he did some work in trying to come up with new ways to predict weather. And instead of just sitting down and writing dull books about insects and worms, he tried to come up with some big overarching ideas in biology. And he realized, looking at his insects and worms, that the structure of the individuals and of their parts, their organs, their faculties, etc., are entirely the result of the circumstances to which the race of each species has found itself subjected by nature. Okay, got that. The reason why organisms look the way they do is because of the environments that they find themselves in. Organisms don't look the way they do for random reasons. They look the way they do because they've been shaped by the environments that they live in. Lamarck was, okay, the idea of evolution is simply change over time. The idea that the life on Earth didn't used to look like what it does now. It has gone through a process of change from something that was very different a long time ago. That idea you can trace back to the ancient Greeks. Darwin certainly wasn't the first to come up with it. I have talked with people before whose minds are a little bit blown from listening to too many old Petra records. And sometimes people seem to think that everybody was perfectly clear that the world was very young and God made absolutely everything, and then Darwin came along and boom, the whole thing blew up. But it's not so. The idea that life had gone through some process of change is very, very old indeed. Lamarck probably deserves credit for being the first to come up with a theory of evolution, not just the idea that life has changed, but what might make it change, what's causing the change, what drives the change. Why should species look the way they do because they're in certain environments? And his ideas were strangely influential. Even though Lamarck himself died desperately poor, being married 5 times will do that, died completely blind, being cared for by one of his daughters, and died so poor that they couldn't pay the rent on his grave, which means that nobody knows where he is now. They dug up his grave and gave it to somebody who could pay. Despite the fact that he got kind of mocked for this while he was alive and never was very successful and probably died thinking he was a total failure, his ideas had this odd, his ideas had 9 lives. His ideas kept on going and ended up influencing a lot of people. They're not entirely wrong even today, although we put some very different, we know a lot more about them than now, but they're not entirely extinct even now. So it goes like this. Put an organism in an environment. That environment will cause the organism to behave in certain ways. So let's say we take a bunch of birds with short legs, sparrows or cardinals or penguins or something like that, and we put them in an environment that's very swampy. Okay, so we've got these in a new environment. Putting them in that new environment will force our birds to start behaving in different ways. For example, it will be bad for them if they get wet. So if they have to hop around on the ground, they're not going to want to hop through puddles or anything like that. So as they walk around on the ground, they're going to stretch their legs as much as they can, much as you will stretch your legs out and take wide strides if you have to jump around among a bunch of puddles, right? You don't want to get your legs wet either. So the environment the birds are in causes them to behave in certain ways, and behavior affects form. If you were in an environment where you had to haul very heavy weights all day, that would affect your form. That would affect your anatomy. Your muscles would start getting larger. Your bones would start getting thicker because your bones remodel themselves according to how much strain you put on them. Weightlifters have much thicker and bulkier bones than couch potatoes do. And so if we have these birds that are hopping around, if they're trying to hop and walk with long strides, the physical exertion of trying to do that is going to make their legs stretch longer and longer over the course of an individual bird's life. So a bird that has to hop around a whole bunch of puddles will end up having longer legs than a bird that never needs to do so. Just like a person that has to carry heavy loads will end up with bigger muscles than a person who only lies on the sofa and plays Roblox or whatever it is that he does. And then the third thing is that changes in form can be inherited. A person that carries heavy loads will not only have heavier muscles, he'll be able to transmit those heavier muscles to any kids that he's got. His kids will be born with larger muscles than they would have if he hadn't been carrying loads. Birds that are hopping around in puddles will not only stretch their legs out during their lives, they'll have babies that have longer legs than they would have if there hadn't been any puddles to hop around. Repeat that over many generations, and you go from sparrows to flamingos, or so said Lamarck. This is sometimes called the inheritance of acquired characters. And we now tend to disparage it as a possibility because we know a lot more about DNA now. It's not possible to reprogram your genes just by physical activity. You know, just because you lift a whole bunch of weights, you know, having big muscles does not reach into the DNA in your gametes and reprogram your muscle development genes. Now, there actually are a few ways that we now know in which something like that can happen, and I might talk about those towards the end. But in Lamarck's thinking, over time, you take this inheritance of acquired traits, combine it with what Lamarck thought was life's innate tendency to increase in complexity and perfection, and that gives rise to the full diversity of complex life, beginning with some kind of little globule in the mud or something like that. So he's diagrammed this over here. The simplest organisms are up at the top, where it's, if you can see this, where it says infusoire, polype, et radiaire. He basically means protists and jellyfish and corals. Ver, up at the top left, that's worms. And then those little dots lead you to insects, arachnids, and crustaceans. Then to annelid, cirripede, and mollusc, segmented worms and barnacles and mollusks. And then by about the middle, you've gone down to fish and reptiles, birds, amphibians, and then down at the bottom, mammifères cétacés, that's whales, and mammifères ongulés, that's hoofed mammals, and mammifères unguiculés, that's mammals with nails, which is basically primates. So notice that when, you know, you might be expecting he would start at the bottom and go to the top. This diagram's arranged from top to bottom, but it's his idea of how you can start with very simple little living, you know, proto-cells or something like that. And through a combination of this inheritance of acquired characters and what Lamarck thought was life's innate tendency to get more complex over time, then you end up with a huge diversity of living things, each of which is adapted to the environment that it's in. Okay, hopefully I am making a certain degree of sense. Lamarck considered his work revolutionary, but his contemporaries thought it was just too speculative. And they thought he should have been spending more time studying the nitty-gritty, those individual insects and worms, and less time trying to come up with these grand, you know, big overarching cosmic ideas. When Lamarck died, his colleague, a paleontologist by the name of Georges Cuvier, delivered a memorial address, which still goes down in history as one of the bitchiest pieces of scientific writing ever written. You know, along the lines of, "We will miss our dear departed colleague. He was certainly imaginative. He had wonderful ideas. What's a shame that they're such total bullshit." Although that's not exactly it, because he did it in French, and of course he is very, very, you know, his ideas were amazing and wonderful, and it is too bad that they are obviously false to anyone who has ever dissected an animal in his life, that sort of thing. So he lost his eyesight. His colleagues thought he was, he'd wasted his time, died in poverty. But his book went on to inspire Robert Grant. So one day as they're strolling through Edinburgh, Grant goes off on this monologue about Lamarck's ideas, which he thinks are the greatest thing ever. And Darwin is just kind of listening and nodding and going, "Oh, okay, wow, huh, okay." Not really sure what to make of this. Lamarck's ideas may also have inspired this fellow, an English physician and general smart guy by the name of Erasmus Darwin, who, by the way, was Charles Darwin's grandfather. Erasmus's son was Robert, the physician whose son was Charles Darwin, our young hero. And I don't think we know exactly how much influence there was, but Dr. Darwin had some very similar ideas to Lamarck's, suggesting that all life had evolved from some common ancestor, some little primordial living glob thing that had changed over time, and its descendants had diversified, and they'd adapted by essentially Lamarckian evolution, by acquiring new features and characters because of the direct influence of the environment upon them. So Erasmus Darwin's ideas are a lot like Lamarck's, although we're not sure how much was borrowing and how much was original. Probably a lot was original. Erasmus Darwin was a very good thinker. He does tend to get his prose a little bit purple. Would it be too bold to imagine that in the great length of time since the earth began to exist, perhaps millions of ages before the commencement of the history of mankind, would it be too bold to imagine that all warm-blooded animals have arisen from one living filament, which the great first cause endued with animality? The great first cause is basically God, but we don't really know anything about him, so we'll just call him the great first cause. Possessing the faculty of continuing to improve by its own inherent activity. That's the ability to make itself change by its behavior, and of delivering down those improvements by generation to its posterity, passing those changes to its offspring, world without end. And he writes this all down in a book called Zoonomia in 1794. And it might have been taken a little bit more seriously if he hadn't been presenting many of his ideas in the form of epic poems. He was actually esteemed for his poetry in his time, but it's not the kind of, it hasn't really held up. So you probably didn't read him in your English lit classes at any point. And so he writes here, organic life beneath the shoreless waves was born and nursed in ocean's pearly caves. First forms minute, unseen by spheric glass, he means a microscope lens, move on the mud or pierce the watery mass. These, as successive generations bloom, new powers acquire and larger limbs assume, whence countless groups of vegetation spring and breathing realms of fin and feet and wing. So yeah, the epic poem is really not considered a suitable vehicle for communicating scientific discoveries. If you're thinking about writing course papers or your master's thesis in the form of an epic, probably ought to stick to prose. I'm just saying here. He might also have been taken more seriously if he hadn't been so enthusiastic about how awesome sex was. When his first wife died, he became an advocate for, let's just call it, free love. He had quite a number of girlfriends, had a number of children by women that he was technically not married to. And if he'd been quiet about it, it would have been one thing, but he had to go and, praise the joys of sex in his poetry. Wrote an entire epic poem called The Loves of the Plants, in which he presents plant reproduction as basically a sort of versified softcore porn. There's a particular flower where you have one pistil, the female part, and 5 stamens, the male parts. Well, he turns reproduction in this plant into a description of one fair young woman being gratified by 5 men in a colorful bed of petals. I wish I was kidding. I'm not. It's the dirtiest botany book certainly the dirtiest botanical poetry that's ever been written. Worth a look if you're into that sort of thing. And even here in his epic, The Temple of Nature, he writes, "Behold," he cries, "earth, ocean, air above, and hail the deities of sexual love. All forms of life shall this fond pair delight, and sex to sex the willing world unite. Hence on green leaves the sexual pleasures dwell, and loves and beauties crowd the blossom's bell. The wakeful anther in his silken bed o'er the pleased stigma bows his waxen head. With meeting lips and mingling smiles they sup ambrosial dewdrops from the nectared cup." What exactly he would make of those flowers that have one pistil and 20 stamens or something like that, I probably can't even imagine. But yeah, he might have been taken a little more seriously if he hadn't written things like this. But I've made him sound like a clown. He was a highly respected doctor. He, I don't know if you know this, but King George III of Great Britain, he tends to be a villain in American history because he's the king that the colonists were rebelling against. You may not know that in the his later years, he suffered from fits of insanity, some kind of mental disturbance. We don't know exactly what it was. I've been to London, and there's the great botanical gardens, Kew Gardens. They were originally the grounds of the palace where they would put him because it was quiet, private, out of the way, and he didn't scare people. He would go around, riding around in his gardens, screaming at, there was a particular tree that he kept having arguments with because he thought that tree was the king of Prussia. That sort of level of mental disturbance. I bring this up because Erasmus Darwin was asked to be his personal physician. They thought that if anybody could do any good for King George III, it would be Dr. Darwin. He actually turned down the job. But that's how well respected he was as a physician. He was an inventor. He founded a society of scientific men. They used to meet every full moon, so they were called the Lunar Society. And they included people like James Watt, who perfected steam engines, Joseph Priestley, the chemist, Matthew Boulton, inventor there. I think he worked on trains. And even Benjamin Franklin, when he was in the country. You might only know Franklin as the weirdo who flew a kite in a thunderstorm, but he was actually one of the best scientists in the world at the time. If you've ever used terms like the positive and negative terminals of a battery, you're using Franklin's coinages. He came up with words like battery and the convention of positive and negative. That's the kind of groundbreaking work Franklin did in electricity. And so, yeah, Erasmus Darwin is hanging out with some of the brainiest people in Britain at the time, and is very much their peer. And he is, in fact, Charles Darwin's grandfather, but the family didn't talk about him very much. I think they were a little bit embarrassed about the way he carried on with his girlfriends later in his life. So, as young Darwin said, when we were walking together, Grant burst into high admiration of Lamarck and his views on evolution. I listened in silent astonishment, and as far as I can judge, without any effect on my mind. I had previously read the Zoonomia of my grandfather, but without producing any effect on me. So Darwin's exposed to this as a college student, but at the time doesn't think very much of it. He's not really impressed with either, his grandfather's work or with, Robert Grant's fanboy appreciation of Lamarck. But, it all ultimately goes into, it's all influence, it's all ideas that he stores in his mind. and now and again, I suppose, thinks about them, even after he leaves medical school and goes off to Cambridge University in Britain to look for another career option. Okay, I'm going to open a new set of slides. If I'll beg your indulgence here. I hope it allows me to do this. I've been having a little bit of difficulty with PowerPoint opening files when I want it to. Uh-oh. Okay. Sorry, I've tried to open a second slide and PowerPoint is going into spinny ball mode. I'll tell you what, I don't normally let you folks leave 15 minutes early, but I'm going to go ahead and stop the share. And I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.